The fog in Sumter, Oregon, didn't just roll in. It clung to the skin like wet wool. Once a booming gold rush hub, the town had long since withered into a skeletal remains of history, its rusted mining relics and weathered wooden facades standing like tombstones against the encroaching forest. For Nadine and her cousin Elena, the town was a graveyard of abandoned dreams. They were orphans of circumstance, bound together by the shared trauma of a broken family, clinging to one another as if they were the only two living souls in a place that had long ago forgotten how to hope. Then came the night of the harvest moon. A shortcut through the shadow-drenched pines near the old Sumter Valley dredge led them into the jaws of something ancient. It was a blur of matted fur, blinding speed, and teeth like jagged shards of iron. Elena escaped with a deep, pulsating gash on her forearm. Nadine wasn't as lucky. She was dragged into the underbrush, mauled, and left for dead in the freezing mud, her pleas for help swallowed by the deafening silence of the surrounding Blue Mountains. The unraveling, weeks passed in Sumter, and while Elena's wound healed into a jagged, angry keloid, Nadine's body began a terrifying, systematic metamorphosis. The physical trauma was only the beginning. Nadine started experiencing blackouts, gaps in her memory where she would wake up in distant, overgrown fields, her fingernails caked with dried mud and copper-scented grime, her clothes shredded. The horror wasn't just the transformation, it was the intellectual decay. Nadine felt her humanity slipping away like sand through her fingers. She became hypersensitive to sound, the erratic heartbeats of the few remaining townsfolk sounding like frantic, rhythmic ticking clocks that begged to be silenced. Elena realized the truth when she found Nadine in their shared bedroom, hunched over a pile of raw, scavenged meat, her eyes glowing with a feral yellow luminescence that lacked any flicker of recognition. Instead of running, Elena made a choice that would seal both their fates. She didn't call the authorities or seek help from the insular, suspicious local precinct. She became Nadine's keeper. She bought raw slabs from the market under the guise of an anemia treatment, reinforced the locks on the cellar door, and scrubbed the floorboards clean of blood, all while hiding her own growing, paralyzing terror. She loved Nadine, but that love was curdling into a toxic, codependent martyrdom. The climax, a feast of betrayal. As the next full moon approached, a blood moon that promised a transformation far more permanent than the last, Sumter began to turn its cold, judging eye toward them. Missing livestock turned into missing residents. The local constable, a man who had always been suspicious of the two girls, began circling their property, his flashlight beam cutting through the mountain fog like a scalpel. Nadine, now lucid for only brief, agonizing windows, realized she could never be cured. She looked at Elena, pale, exhausted, and trembling, and realized that their bond had become a suffocating prison. The final night was not a battle against the monster, but a battle for dignity. Nadine chained herself to the heavy iron heating pipe in the cellar, begging Elena to run, but Elena couldn't let go. When the transformation hit, it wasn't the clumsy, painful shift of before. It was violent, absolute, and bone-snapping. The beast that emerged was no longer Nadine, but a creature of pure ancestral rage. In her final, fleeting moment of human awareness, Nadine lunged, not at the constable who had just breached the cellar door, but at the chains binding her. She tore herself free, sacrificing skin and muscle to the rusted metal, and bolted into the night. She didn't kill Elena, but she left her behind, forcing her cousin to finally face the wreckage of their lives alone, knowing that the thing that used to be her sister was now out there, hunting everything they had ever feared. The lingering dread. The story ends with Elena, months later, sitting in a quiet, sterile office in a distant city. She traces the scar on her arm, looking out the window at a patch of dark, overgrown trees. She hears a low, guttural howl, a sound that is distinctly, terrifyingly familiar. And for the first time, she doesn't feel fear. She feels a strange, twisted sense of belonging. The curse didn't just take Nadine. It had infected the way Elena saw the world. She wasn't just the cousin of a werewolf. She was the silent architect of a nightmare that would never truly die. The air in the basement was thick with the copper tang of blood and the metallic smell of the rusted heating pipe. Nadine's body shuddered, a sound like dry branches snapping, echoing in the small, cramped space. Her skin pulled tight across her cheekbones, gray and clammy. "Nadine, look at me," Elena whispered, her voice trembling as she pressed her back against the cellar door. She clutched a heavy kitchen knife, her knuckles white. Her own forearm pulsed with a dull, rhythmic ache, the scar from the night of the attack burning as if it were still fresh. Nadine's head snapped up. Her pupils, usually a soft hazel, were dilated until the iris was gone, swallowed by a flat, terrifying black. She tried to speak, but the sound that tore from her throat was a wet, guttural growl that made Elena flinch. "I'm still here," Elena lied, tears streaming down her face. She stepped forward, ignoring the way her own instincts screamed at her to bolt. She reached out, her fingers hovering inches from Nadine's shoulder. "We're going to get through this. Just like before. I have the locks. I have everything you need." Nadine's hand shot out, not to strike, but to grip Elena's wrist. Her strength was inhuman. Nadine's fingernails dug into Elena's skin, drawing beads of dark blood. "Run," Nadine rasped, the word barely recognizable as human speech. Her jaw clicked, shifting, the bone structure visibly lengthening even as she fought it. Above them, the floorboards creaked. The heavy, deliberate thud of boots announced the presence of the town constable. He had been lurking outside for hours, the beam of his flashlight flickering through the cracks in the cellar windows, searching for the source of the frantic, animalistic noises. "Elena, get away from the door," the constable shouted from above, his voice muffled by the wood. "I know something is in there. I'm coming down." Nadine's grip on Elena tightened until Elena gasped in pain. The girl's eyes began to glow with that sickly, yellow luminescence. She wasn't fighting the change anymore. The hunger was overriding her consciousness, turning her mind into a void of pure, predatory intent. "He's going to kill us both," Nadine hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying, dual-toned dissonance. The human girl she was, and the beast she was becoming, fighting for control of the same throat. Nadine yanked Elena closer, forcing her cousin to look directly into the widening abyss of her eyes. "If he opens that door," Nadine growled, her face contorting, the skin beginning to split along her jawline. "He won't find a girl. He'll find what killed the livestock, and he'll kill you for hiding it." The basement door at the top of the stairs groaned under the pressure of the constable's boot. He was picking the lock. Elena looked at the chain, then at the knife, then at her cousin, the only person who had ever truly loved her. The realization hit her. The basement was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb. "I'm not leaving you," Elena sobbed, gripping the knife so tightly the handle bit into her palm. Nadine let out a sound of pure, agonizing frustration, a howl that began in her chest and tore through the house. The house shook. Dust rained from the rafters. The transformation was accelerating, fueled by her desperate, primal fear of discovery. Her bones cracked with the sound of gunshots, and she began to drag herself toward the center of the room, her body arching in a grotesque, unnatural angle. The lock at the top of the stairs clicked open. The door began to creak inward. How will Elena choose between protecting her cousin's secret and surviving the arrival of the constable? The cellar door swung inward, and a sliver of harsh moonlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the swirling dust motes and the frantic scene below. Constable Miller stood at the top of the stairs, his silhouette framed by the porch light, his service weapon drawn and leveled at the shadows. "Step away from her, Elena," Miller commanded, his voice sharp, devoid of his usual neighborly warmth. I've seen the state of the property, the blood in the yard. I know what's been happening here. Elena stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Below her, Nadine was a nightmare in motion. The sound of shifting cartilage was sickening, a rhythmic wet grinding as her spine elongated. Her clothes were shredded into rags, exposing skin that was turning a mottled, bruised gray, thick, with coarse, wire-like hair sprouting along her limbs. Nadine wasn't just changing, she was coming undone. "Don't look at her!" Elena screamed, not at Miller, but at her own reflection in the darkness. She pivoted, putting her body between the constable and the creature. "You don't understand. She's sick. She's just a monster," Miller spat, taking the first step down the wooden stairs. The wood groaned under his weight. "And you're an accomplice." From behind Elena, a sound erupted that wasn't human. It was a low, vibratory growl that rattled the foundations of the house. Nadine's arm shot out, her hand now a claw of exposed, raw muscle and jagged, obsidian-colored talons. She didn't strike at Miller. Instead, she swung with terrifying precision at the rusted iron pipe she was chained to. The impact was deafening. The pipe, weakened by years of damp and neglect, shuddered. Nadine roared, a sound that was pure, primal fury, and yanked. With a screech of tortured metal, the anchor bolt tore through the rotting floor joist. Nadine was free. She didn't immediately lunge for Miller. She dropped to all fours, her back arching in a spine-snapping crack that made Elena vomit into her own mouth. The creature that stood up was nearly 7 feet tall, a mass of lupine muscle and malice, its muzzle wet with foam and blood. Its eyes, burning with a hellish intelligent gold, locked onto the constable. Miller fired. The gunshot roared in the confined space, a deafening explosion of sound and light. The bullet caught the beast in the shoulder, spraying dark, viscous fluid across the basement walls. The creature stumbled, yelping in pain, but the injury seemed only to catalyze its rage. Nadine's head whipped toward the window, a small, square opening that led out into the Sumter night. "Elena, get out!" Nadine shrieked, though the words were mangled by a throat that was no longer built for human speech. The beast lunged, not at the exit, but at the stairs. She plowed into the constable with the force of a freight train. Miller flew backward, crashing into the porch landing above with a sickening thud. The flashlight skittered across the floor, its beam spinning wildly, painting the walls in dizzying flashes of light and shadow. Elena didn't think. She moved. She grabbed the fallen flashlight and scrambled toward the hole in the wall where the piping had been ripped away. Behind her, the sounds of a struggle, the tearing of fabric, the frantic shouting of a dying man, and the wet, predatory snapping of jaws filled the cellar. Elena shoved her body through the splintered opening, tumbling into the freezing mud of the Sumter yard. She scrambled to her feet, her breath hitching in her chest, and turned back to look at the cellar. A massive furred shape leaped from the opening, silhouetted against the harvest moon. It landed with cat-like grace in the mud, turned its massive head toward her for one singular terrifying heartbeat, and then bounded toward the tree line. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, from the basement, a low, wet moan drifted out into the night air, followed by the heavy, thudding silence of a corpse hitting the dirt. Elena stood alone in the dark, the flashlight shaking in her hand, the smell of blood and wet fur clinging to her clothes like a second skin. She knew, with a sudden cold certainty, that the life she had lived until tonight was gone forever. Elena stood in the mud, the cold seeping through her boots, but she felt nothing. The only sound in the suffocating silence of the Sumter night was her own ragged, shallow breathing. She walked toward the cellar opening, the flashlight beam trembling in her hand. She didn't want to see, but she had to know. The light cut through the gloom, settling on the mess of blood and splintered wood. The constable was gone, dragged, or worse. Elena's light, caught something caught on a jagged, splintered floorboard near the exit. It was a piece of fabric, a torn scrap of Nadine's favorite sweater, the one they had bought together at a thrift store in Baker City just last month. It was stained with dark arterial spray. Nearby, her silver locket, the one containing a picture of them as children, lay crushed in the dirt. The chain snapped as if by a massive violent force. She picked it up, the metal biting into her palm. She called out, her voice a fragile, broken thing. "Nadine?" There was no response, only the rustle of wind through the skeletal trees of the Blue Mountains. Days turned into a blur. The town of Sumter didn't just investigate, it hunted. Elena became the pariah, the girl who lived in the house of horrors, the girl whose cousin had vanished into the woods, leaving a trail of bodies behind her. She was questioned until her voice was raw, forced to weave lies about how they had been attacked by a wild animal, how she had barely escaped with her life. She sold everything. She moved to a claustrophobic apartment in a city where the sun never seemed to hit the pavement. She changed her name, bleached her hair, and stopped looking in mirrors because she couldn't stand the sight of the scar on her arm, the mark of her own complicity. But the silence was the heaviest burden of all. One rainy Tuesday, months later, Elena sat by her window, staring at the gray horizon. She had spent every night since the incident, leaving her balcony door cracked open, a bowl of water on the floor, a blanket she'd worn tossed in the corner. It was a pathetic, desperate ritual of a girl who refused to let go of a monster. A sound drifted up from the alleyway below. It wasn't a howl. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching against the brick wall. A whine, high-pitched and unmistakably, agonizingly human. Elena's heart stopped. She rushed to the window, throwing it open, her breath hitching in her throat. "Nadine?" she whispered, leaning over the ledge. Below in the shadows stood a creature. It was gaunt, its fur matted with city grime and oil, its eyes dull and clouded. It looked up, and for a split second the golden glow in its eyes flickered, a brief haunting flash of the girl who had shared Elena's secrets, her fears, and her life. The creature took a tentative step toward the fire escape, a low, yearning sound vibrating in its chest. Then it stopped. It saw the fear in Elena's eyes, the way she recoiled, the way her hand instinctively covered the scar on her arm. It realized, with the clarity of a dying ember, that it was not the person Elena loved, but the thing that had destroyed her. The creature let out a sound of pure, shattered heartbreak, a whimpering, mournful wail that died in the rain and turned back toward the darkness. It didn't look back again. Elena watched it vanish into the labyrinth of the city, knowing she had just driven away the last piece of her family. She sat on the floor, the rain soaking the curtains, and realized with a crushing, absolute finality that she would never be cured of her love, and Nadine would never be cured of her curse. They were two halves of a tragedy, destined to haunt each other in the shadows, forever out of reach. She turned off the light, leaving the door unlocked, and waited for a guest who would never be able to come home.